Welcome to a very special episode of Let's Talk. I'm Pastor Hilly. My guest today has a lot of titles, a lot of uh, um, superlatives can be used to describe him. He's a pastor, an author, a husband, a father, and a title I know means the world to him: a grandfather, a former colleague, a dear friend, and someone I am lucky enough to call a mentor. The good Reverend William S. Carter. Pastor Carter, how are you, sir?
I'm great, Pastor Hilly. It's good to see you, even if it's this way. And I'm glad to be catching up and have a chance to contribute to your congregation's Advent experience. Thanks a lot for reaching out to me.
Absolutely. And thank you for making time in your schedule. I called you yesterday, day before, with this idea I had been kicking around in Advent, which we are days away from the start of.
Yeah,
We are doing a Tuesday morning Advent morning prayer. And I am basing that around a little book you released last year before.
it was the year before. So this is the second Advent.
Second Advent of it. The book
Yeah,
is titled But Mary Kept All These Things. I have it right here so I can pitch it as much as need be. And I love this. I just love everything about the project. And it is, and please use this as a jumping off point, it is daily devotions slash reflections for every day of the Advent season that are reworkings of Christmas Eve sermons from your career as a parish pastor.
that's right. I got the idea a year or two after I retired because the only sermons I had kept were Easter and Christmas Eve sermons. So I looked through the Christmas Eve sermons and I liked them and I mailed them off and said, how about a collection of Christmas Eve sermons? And they wrote back and said, if you could turn that into a daily devotional for Advent, we'll do it. And I said, I'll do it too. So during the year of COVID, I reshaped those sermons into these devotions for Advent stories that continue to take an opportunity to let Christmas speak to Advent. So those images of the manger and Christmas trees and Christmas carols, the things that carry us through Advent in our relatively secular society, can be used to prepare us for the ultimate joy of Christmas morning, Christmas Eve services. So I'm appreciating the opportunity to say some things about that for your Tuesdays. Mostly, I think we like to continue in the church with the liturgical season on the Advent Sundays. The first one is usually about the necessity of watchfulness because things are going to get bad. The second Sunday in Advent, we are introduced to John the Baptist foretelling the Messiah coming. This year, the third Sunday in Advent is going to say Jesus is going to reveal that John the Baptist is the messenger of God. And on the fourth Sunday of Advent, you, with your congregation, will read from Matthew, and it will be Joseph's dream, Matthew's story of how Joseph found out that God had chosen Mary. So this time in Advent on your Tuesdays, I think is going to be a little different. I hope you'll enjoy it.
Oh, I think it absolutely will. And one of the things that I learned from you in our time together was the benefit and the blessing of including as many different voices as possible in the worship moment, in the preaching moment, in the moment of devotions. And so I think that our Tuesday experience, bringing in your voice as this consistent throughout this season to add this secondary narrative, I think it gives a lot of different approaches to this season. This past Sunday was Christ the King Sunday, and you and I
Yes,
spoke about this briefly. Christ the King Sunday, that great exclamation point at the end of the church year. But I was like, how do we rework this, and how do we turn Christ the King Sunday into this moment of preparation to get ready for the waiting of Advent? Right? Because,
right,
it's that wonderfully
right.
cyclical nature of the liturgical year that we are preparing a way for the Lord, which is the Son of God, which is Christ the King. And, it shows that diversity of images that cascade on one another, that the
Yep.
wood of the manger is the wood of the cross, that Christ the King
Right.
is the one in the stable.
And what I tried to use in the book on that, and I think still works really well, is Mary, the ponderer. She's the one that shows up at the manger, but then, of course, she's the only one that continues through the entire story. Mm-hmm. The water into wine, the ultimate reality of the preaching, and of course, she's at the cross. But in terms of how it works for Advent, I think I'd just like to read a little passage from the second piece about Mary, Ponder These Things, which kind of lays out that idea about how I'm stuck every Advent because my brain wants to think about the manger and Christmas and trees and the rest of it. And so this is where that came from. Every Advent, my thoughts run ahead to the Nativity, the birth and the manger. I can't help it. That scene is the center. Absolutely everything else is trimming, garnish, the setting of beauty, but the stone, the gem, the pearl of great price would be laid before us freely in the simple story of the manger and the figures gathered there in the darkness, the Word made flesh. The whole story expands slowly from the center. In Advent, we often think about Mary's response at the Annunciation when the angel Gabriel came to her in Nazareth to tell her she would bear a child. But I think our minds, at least my mind, runs ahead to the manger at the center. I think it can be a good thing to ponder the reality of Christmas story in Advent, the child in the manger. And in a certain way, I think that Advent is our version of the Annunciation. Mm-hmm. And the images and the stories that we use are the ones that we know have to do with who is coming. So it is the manger, it is the tree, it is the carols, and it is the stories of how our families have celebrated those times at Christmas. In a certain level, every Christmas, every Advent allows us to immerse ourselves in all the Christmases we have ever known. And that is fun, I think, that mixture of voices and stories.
And I think that that is a theme you come back to so many different times, like across all 4 weeks of it, whether you're talking about, we had a meeting last night and I used an excerpt from, I believe it's Christmas Eve, keep the bows.
Yes.
Where you talk about collecting the bows like you did in your childhood, not because you need them, but in the act of collecting them, you are reminded, A, of your childhood, and not of the gifts, but of the people that you bought gifts for.
Right.
And
right.
how these, and I want to deep dive on this in a few minutes, but you talk about your mom setting up the manger scene underneath the Christmas tree and the paper bag hills that the wise men are on. Or
sure.
you talk about, there's more than a handful that kind of work on this idea of things you saw while driving. And so you do this wonderful, you create these images and these sermons in this wonderful way that the entry point as a reader, as somebody doing home devotions, or as somebody in the pew, you can say, oh, well, I've driven before, or I remember the childhood of my youth, or I remember X, I remember Y,
sure.
which is, I think, key to welcoming people around the manger, to inviting them into that story. And I think it's from the same excerpt you were just reading. You talk about the difference between centripetal force and centrifugal force, where the manger is the thing that pulls us into the center of it. It's not the drop in the ocean that goes out. It's the center of time in a lot of ways.
Well, I think we did that at St. Matthew too. When you were there, we had a manger, which we, each of the 4 Sundays in Advent, we took it down the aisle, right in the middle of the aisle. It sat there getting closer to the altar each week. I mean, I think the manger is what draws us. That's why we have the crazy manger here in our house that I talk about in one of those stories, with every animal that you can imagine gathered around, animals that we have collected and gathered and been given as gifts over the years. So it's not just the donkey and the ox. It's a hippopotamus from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and an elephant that someone got or bought when they were in India. It's a fun piece to allow other people's stories, certainly our family stories, to be a part of this. Because even though it's exactly the same Christmas story from Luke all the time, it's still a different set of stories, a different set of ears. My favorite author is a person who's become a friend, I'm happy to say, Colin McCann. And I put an epigraph in this little book because he understands what stories are about. Sharing our stories reminds us of what we believe in and helps us to make sense of a fickle world. They are common, yet we tell them because our experiences are so uncommon. No two stories are ever the same, even when told by the same person, using the same words. And that's the reality of the incarnation for me. Advent is a time for preparing, but it comes out and pulls you in. And we all have stories, not only pastors. We all have stories to tell. And I think that's really what the opportunity is for your Tuesdays, to share some of those stories that the people that are there participating with you will also remember. Hearing my crazy stories, if you share things from the book about United Parcel Trucks, these are the things that people say, I remember something just like that, which was, to be honest, and very, this is meant to be incredibly modest, that's how it worked for me as a preacher. People would come out and say, you reminded me of this that I did. Thank you for that. So I think the gospel is an amazing reminder. And Advent, why not indulge that for these 4 weeks?
Oh, 100%. So when we talk about how we tell that story, so I know that from the time that we spend together, we both take a lot of time and consideration, especially preaching on Sundays in the season of Advent, to make sure that Advent sermons are Advent sermons and not necessarily Christmas Eve sermons or Christmas sermons, because it's building that anticipation, right? It's or it's preparing in the appropriate way, right? And I find that the closer, and I'm still this way, the when it gets to Advent 3 or 4, I'm in that Christmas mind frame. I want to write Christmas Eve, but you don't want to give up the ghost, right? Like you want to
right, exactly.
So what was
the only relief we get is that Advent 4, the closing hymn, should be Joy to the World. Finally, we get to sing one, which is the last of the Advent section before Christmas starts. And there's no reason not to trickle and use the carols first on Sundays, but we do try and pause a bit. We do try and move directly to it when it's time.
When you sit down and you're looking at Christmas Eve sermons, and your task is, all right, let me remold these to be Advent devotionals. Was that easier than you thought it was going to be? Was it more challenging? Was there some part in the back of your brain that is, these were the sermons I wanted to write in Advent anyway? Did you know what I mean? How did that feel?
Yeah, I think it was, I saw it as a challenge. And then as I began to look at what I had written and some of the images from Christmas letters, I realized that it could work by just taking some things and not including them and reminding myself to use the word Advent. Certainly, it was my experience for the last, 30 years of my life, if not more, that I was spending time in Advent thinking about Christmas. Not just the sermon, but what a gift I was going to buy for someone else. Do we have enough cards to send? Is there a Christmas letter to write? Those things were real. And we decorate at home by the second week in Advent. We get the mangers out and collection of those, and it worked very well for me. And I'm happy about that. As a matter of fact, I had some conversations afterwards from some friends who said, well, why don't you do that for Lent? And to be honest, I can't imagine the challenge that it would present to change Easter sermons into Lenten meditations.
Yeah.
But for me, this idea of Christmas and the calling that the wise men got by a star and the shepherds got by angels, and the reality that everyone is there, the Gentiles as represented by the donkey, and the Jews and those who believed already as represented by the ox. I think this is just a much easier reality to use the joy, anticipation, the spiritual pilgrimage of Advent to get to the manger ourselves. As I talk about it, the Bethlehem in our hearts. That's where we're heading. I've been privileged enough to be in Bethlehem, but not a lot of people have. But there is a Bethlehem in our hearts, whether that's our childhood or what the Bible reveals to us as we read it today in those Christmas Gospels.
And as you talk about the myriad of characters that especially Luke as an author gives us in his gospel, but especially there in chapter 2, I appreciate how much throughout the text you kind of razz on the shepherds, because you're flushing them out as characters, right?
Yes.
Yes. I'd say every time you mention them, you always kind of say, in our minds, we kind of church up the shepherds a little more. They probably weren't as honest as you. I live in a world where I'll talk to friends who are in, I play in a card league and that kind of thing. And
yes.
I give the invitation like, hey, if you want to come to Easter, come to Christmas, like come
sure.
by and be fine. And people always say, oh, if I walk into a church, it's going to, fall
sure.
down.
Yeah.
And so I always kind of tune in on those kind of descriptors, especially of characters in well-known places, because again, I think that that's what allows us to see ourselves in the text. And you in the Sunday, the first Sunday of Advent, you're talking about the Christmas tree at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and how you and Ruth got there early and it was still being built up, and the picture perfect manger underneath the crumbling Roman statuaries remains. And it's that juxtaposition that you have the heavenly host and the angels. And you also have, shepherds who are the pirates of the first century.
Right. Or who don't quite measure up. And in that way, from my perspective, are exactly like us.
Mm-hmm.
They have some qualities that are good and some qualities, well, not quite as good as we would hope to be. Not to offend anyone who's listening, but the reality is that allows me to enter the story because I'm just like that. And that's why I think Luke tells the story for his audience that the shepherds are the ones who find them. The shepherds who have a little bit of an unsavory reputation, even though they were watching the sheep that were going to be sacrificed at the temple. There's the good and there's the I could be better. That reality, that invites us into the story. And I think I mentioned that, watching my mother set the shepherds on top of Paper Bag Hill, knowing they were not yet down there. That was the place I always wanted to be, was with the shepherds and the campfire. I grew up in a 2-room apartment in Brooklyn, New York. It would be great to be camping out with a fire in the night, having a wonderful time, snow or not, I thought. And then when I read Luke's gospel, and you do, and your people do, I think that's exactly where Luke wants us to find ourselves. That God's going to find a way, whether it's angels, a United Parcel Truck, or a Christmas carol that we hear at the mall and reminds us of a Christmas 20 years ago. That's what gets us to say, let's go worship at the manger. Sorry, I don't preach enough, so I have to work it in sometimes.
No, the image of because you go back to this well a lot, and every time you go back to it, I get really excited reading through it. Your mom setting up the manger scene underneath the tree, and there's a white sheet, and she makes a hill out of a brown paper bag. And painstakingly and lovingly sits there until the little figure, the shepherd figurines, are standing up, not falling over, but standing up, and everything is set. And I every time you went back to that image in the book, I just kept thinking to myself, what a beautiful metaphor for like the faith that we keep coming back, that undergirds all of the journeys that we make to Bethlehem. Like, what is the thing that we are standing on? And it is this painstaking and loving and patient foundation that is set by those who have like prepared the way for the Lord in our hearts.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. And that's what I love about the stories in sermons that you preach, because I've heard you, and that I preach, is that they're true.
Mhm.
It really did happen that way. I really did watch her work so hard to get it done. And it wasn't easy, but then it worked and they were there. So I think those images that we have of our stories of childhood or adulthood, or even stories that we've heard from others, allow us to nurture in ourselves a sense of pilgrimage, a sense of discovery, a sense of a spiritual journey that gets us to Bethlehem right on time. And let's start the journey Sunday, please. I think there's no sense waiting and trying to pull this all off in 24 hours. We are intended by the church. That's why there is an Advent season, to allow us to be drawn toward that place. I hope your Tuesdays are full of that sense of anticipation and waiting at the same time.
As do I. I mean, that is 100% the goal. And part of that is underlining the way you write in that first the essay entry for the first Sunday of Advent, when you're talking about all the things that Advent carries with it, the baking of cookies and the getting the tree and the bringing it home and the set, and that this is not a laundry list of things that must be done, period. But these are like proactive ways that we are preparing the way.
Sure.
And I think that it's the way that we intentionally create the way that we remember preparing for the season. You know, and I was listening to an unrelated interview today, and the guy was talking about his experience with faith and religion. And he said the search for meaning is the mystical religious part of it.
Sure.
And I think that there is some truth to that. It is, you know, the power of that journey of Advent, of getting excited, of going on a trip, and you get, you know, 2 miles from your destination and you're already there. For you, you know, driving from Brooklyn, New York to Ruthven, Minnesota, for me, North Carolina to Columbus, Ohio. You know, when you start off, you're really excited. When you get about a half hour away from where you're going, you get really excited. It's, you know, there's a couple 100 miles in the middle.
Yes, where you just keep going. That's what you try and do. You just keep going. I don't know. I think it's Advent is an opportunity to acknowledge that we are seeing all these things. We are baking, we are wrapping, we are buying, we are making choices. We're deciding to do cards or not cards. Please send cards. It's a good thing. Reach out to people. They open it up. They haven't seen you. There's something there. And that's an Advent worship, I think, a preparation, a spiritual journey to the place we all want to be. Surrounded, in my experience, by all those crazy animals and all the people that are just like us and all the people that are so different to us. That's where the angels are singing. That's why the star led the wise man. It's a good thing. And I know you're doing it well there in Ohio. I'm pleased to have pastors that are telling this story and making it move forward for their people. That's the reality, for their people. And because then it moves on. Ruth bakes a special Norwegian cookie because her grandmother did. It has a little wooden cone that you wrap it around. It's called a krumkaker. Petra, who's now 15, has been baking those with Ruth since she was 3. Petra at 15 does not want to be photographed. At 14 last year, does not want to be photographed. But I have a photograph of Petra holding up a finished krumkaker last Advent when she was baking with Ruth. And it's the biggest smile I have ever had the chance to see. So we are passing these stories on as we tell them, and someone else is remembering their own stories to pass on to their families. Please God, that's true. I believe it. I trust it. That's the gospel for me.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that, especially coming out of the last 2 years that we all just lived for, when we talk about what can be considered an Advent devotion, I think that it's a really good idea. And maybe I'll push this here at Faith, that as an Advent devotion, to send those cards of invitation, right?
Yeah.
I mean, especially in Luke's gospel, think about everybody who is invited, or all the different ways that people are invited to be part of the story. You know,
Yeah.
from the wise men to Mary to Joseph to, you know, X, Y, and Z. Yeah, to invite people back to a place, and maybe back for the first time in a long time.
Yes. Well, it has been that. And I think the opportunity now to be able to worship in person is just a gift worth unwrapping. And it's certainly a gift for us. And I know it will be for you and for your people. So thankfully, this looks like we're going to have an opportunity to do that, to hear an organ, to hear a carol, to participate by adding our voice to the group, and not just be worshiping in isolation. I mean, the monks and nuns kept that alive in the Dark Ages, but we have an opportunity now to get back in the story with the lights in the church and the candles in our hands, with someone next to us in the pew, in front of us in the pew, that we haven't seen for a time. May it be true, I hope. I know that that's my hope for this Christmas.
Pastor Carter, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for this book. But Mary kept all these things. Again, it is the basis here at Faith Lutheran Church for our Tuesday Advent morning devotions, which are every Tuesday in the season. My friend, thank you so much.
Well, thanks very much for reaching out. It's an opportunity that I've cherished and will remember. Send me a tape. And
Will do.
happy Advent, Pastor.
Also with you.
Bye-bye.